This is Kimberly, and this is Exec Edge powered by Uniqua AI, the podcast where you can unique insights and meet real world AI. Each week, we break down all sorts of things that are on in the business world and smart systems and turn them into practical tips that you can use in your work, your business, and in your everyday life. And to kick things off today, we're going to talk to Macon, and I'll tell a little bit about sort of the origins of this podcast as we get started, and then we'll kick right into the conversation. Unique AI started from a pattern I kept seeing when I was working with large enterprise technology companies. Even the most sophisticated organizations struggle to move quickly when it comes to AI innovation, making changes, and things like that. The ideas are there, the intent is there, but agility often isn't. And so, what's fascinated me was that the smaller founder led businesses actually have the opposite problem. They can move fast, but they don't always know where to start or how to apply systems and technology in a way that's practical, responsible, and tied to real business incomes. So, Exec Edge sort of came out of that as a place for me to talk to different business owners, founders, and leaders to get some thought leadership in what's going on in the world of work today, technology, and what's going on with the roadmaps of the future. So, we'll talk today with Macon. I am Kimberly Cohen, your host, and I wanted to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Awesome. Well, Macon, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? I know we've talked previously, but I want the audience to know a little bit more about you, where you're at right now, where you've come from, and what you're seeing in terms of what's going on in the world of work today for you.
Yeah. So my name is Macon Albertson, and I actually live in the Carolinas. And I've been in the staffing, recruiting, consulting industry since I got out of college in '94. So it's been a long time. It seems like it started yesterday, but 32 years of really working in and around employment, you know, team building, workforce issues, soup to nuts. I've been pretty lucky. I've worked for some smaller firms, especially currently. I've been doing consulting, trying to help smaller firms get over the hump so they can continue to grow. But also was very fortunate to lead some of the largest companies in our industry and learn from some of the absolute best in the business. I mean, some people would say I'm an expert. I would challenge that. I carry a lot of expertise that I've learned from experts. And and so excited to be here today and chat with you about the AI and the impacts in the world of work. And we'll go from there.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much. I know in our previous chat before we got onto this podcast, we talked about your origins. It's funny, we both graduated college the same year. So I feel you. It feels like it was yesterday. Weren't the
Yep.
90s like 10 years ago?
Where'd
I
it
mean,
go?
where did it go?
Yep.
We've gone
Yep.
too fast, but we look too good to worry about it. So we'll keep pushing.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
So tell me a little bit about your origins. I know you started at Aerotech. I've heard a lot about Aerotech from my husband. A lot of the methodologies, probably that you apply even today, are rooted in those origins. So tell me a little bit about how you got started with them, and where that led you.
Yeah. So, right out of college, I needed to get a job. Right. So, met one of the actual founders of Aerotech at an airport bathroom. And we just struck up a conversation. I was telling the guy I needed a job, and he's like, "Hey, I'm on my way to actually what at the time was the Raleigh office." And he's like, "If you want to come see me tomorrow, I think you're the type of person we would hire." And so, they offered me a job as a recruiter, although I wasn't really sure what I was going to be doing. Right? I always, tell people, Kimberly, you and I, in people of our age, we're the youngest group of people that started work before computers.
Yes.
And so, I'd never heard of the company. It wasn't like you could go Google it. I didn't know what
Right.
being a recruiter was, right? I just knew I needed a job. And so I went to Raleigh the next day. They kind of quasi explained some things to me. I still didn't totally understand it, but it didn't matter. Seemed like a great place to be, a lot of young people and that type of thing. And so They made me an offer, and I started and didn't really realize what I was going to be doing until about the second day of training. Which was in Maryland at the time, and Aerotech is now a Legis Group. It's literally the nation's largest staffing, recruitment, workforce organization, still privately held. But when I went to work there, it wasn't quite so big. It was about a $60 million company, I think, at the time. They kept that kind of close to the vest, but that's probably my estimates. And it was a bunch of young people that were at the right place at the right time. The one thing that separated Allegis from all the other companies that had been doing it for so long before, and what enabled them to grow, was they just had some really smart owners, and they had a superior business model, and they and training and development program. And you know as we were talking the other day, I mean, I remember I started in Charlotte. We were the first group to go to Charlotte. It was like 5 of us, and within a year there was 75 of us. I mean, we grew tremendously quickly. And it was the business model and the rigor and the things that we were doing. And again, we couldn't waste a lot of time because we didn't have computers to distract us. So we were pretty gritty group of people that just hammered the phones and built relationships one by one, and built our business based on referrals back in those days.
Right. Yeah, and as I understand, you all were tasked with going out. You had to do X amount of lunches. You had to do X amount of uh, the outreach expectations were. It seems like a lot more hands-on, obviously, than they are these days with the advent of technology. But can you speak to what that looked like then versus what it looks like today for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Technology in itself is supposed to enhance productivity. And in a lot of cases, and in our industry, I think we're guilty of it, where it kind of works against you in some respects. So back in those days, as I said, we opened the office from nothing in Charlotte, Aerotech's first Charlotte office. And there was no computers, there was no job boards, there was no nothing. And so we had to find candidates. And really in those days, you had two ads you could run in the paper. It was Sunday job section and a Wednesday job section. And and by the way, people had to mail you their resumes, right? There wasn't that was even before faxes, right? So
Excellent.
we had to be extremely proactive. So one of the things that we did, by the way, is, and it sounds silly to a lot of people today, but it's kind of how we started the business. On Fridays, we would stand at gas stations for hours and introduce ourselves, strategic gas stations, introduce ourselves to people pumping gas and ask them what they did, letting them know what recruiters were. And back in those days, not a lot of people knew what recruiters were. And, we sat out there as 20-year-old guys and gals and handed business cards to people and invited them to a conversation. And we really maximized every conversation. And, an example would be if we had scheduled a lunch with a candidate, we would say, hey, if you can bring two people with you, we'll pay for their lunch too. It doesn't matter what they do. If they're professionals, bring them. Bring two of your best friends, and that's kind of how we built the business. Is we wanted to, and we did intentionally talk to anybody and everybody whenever we could, because it led to something, right?
Right.
It may not be for tomorrow, right? But it may be for 6 months from now or whatever. And, now in the business, recruiters and salespeople and stuff, you've got LinkedIn. And so, if we had that back in those days and worked with the same approach, we'd be on the phone 10 times as much. But today we tend to screen people out and figure out reasons not to contact them. But back
Yeah.
in those days, it was like, hey, all I needed was a name and phone number, and I was going to call you, and I was going to figure out what you did, who your brothers and sisters were, your cousins, where you worked, who the guy in the cube next to you was. We were really good at extracting information. And I one of the guys I worked with used to say, "Hey, there's not a lot of difference between us and the people in the CIA. We're just working people for, we're working our sources for different outcomes, but
Yeah.
our
Absolutely.
job is to keep them on the phone and get more names and get more phone numbers so that we can build our databases and build connectivity to the community, and both from a candidate standpoint and a client standpoint."
Yeah, absolutely. You 3-foot ruled them. As I think they used to talk about that, right? Anybody within a 3 foot radius is kind of fair
Yeah,
game
man.
for conversation.
Absolutely. And because it was so hard to actually, a lot of people don't realize that in 1995 and 4 and 6 and 7, before there was any really tools available, it was actually hard to find somebody to call. And we see salespeople and recruiters today, and they're sitting at their desk and they're not on the phones. And I'm like, if you're not on the phone, you kind of have to ask yourself, what are you doing? Like, don't look at that person, call them and make a connection. Find out what makes them tick, what kind of opportunities they're looking for. Clients the
Uh,
same way. Every client in America has needs that they're challenged to fill, right? And they might, and most likely a third party is a great solution for them, or some kind of consulting solution, that's whether it be a business process outsourcing solution or an IT services solution or whatever. But nothing happens until you connect with people, and when you connect with a lot of people, a lot happens. You know,
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, that I'm finding that out. I think we talked about this the other day. I just set out away from corporate America to start this business maybe, a couple months ago. And it really is, getting out there, having some resources to make those connections and find out who is a good fit, and then really reaching out to them and having conversations, I think is a lost art in a lot of ways. I've found that a lot of executive functions are not being cultivated as much, recently in recent years, and some of the folks that I'm running into. And, I think maybe COVID had something to do with that a little bit, but I feel like the advent of technology has made it a lost art, that really face to face communication, talking, extracting information, not just for specific purposes, but also just to get to know people and relationship building. Because
exactly.
ultimately, in my estimation, and I'm sure in your vast history as well, those relationships are what get you through. They get you referrals, they get you additional business. Maybe it's connections where you're just connecting the dots for others, and then obviously that helps. It comes back to you tenfold after, in the end, when you're trying to build your business, or build something of your own.
That's right.
So
That's right.
yeah. Yeah, and so, in terms of the culture that you learned, from Allegis Aerotech, tell me a little bit about that. I love hearing stories about it. I think, we mentioned that my husband also worked for Aerotech back in the day, around the same era, and, one thing about the culture there was what they used to call carefrontation, and, I've heard a lot of really good stories about how the culture was so collaborative. It was so flat. It was a flat organization, relatively, and that collaboration. Tell me how that worked.
Yeah, so I mean, the and again, this is part of the brain trust that ran the business. They knew they were going to end up with a company with thousands of people who were under the age of 25. I can't even imagine today trying to manage that, although I have managed some. And they had a what I would call a high accountability environment, and it was shared accountability. And
Uh-huh.
and I can give you a couple examples, but Carefrontations was one of them. It's like, hey, if you see somebody that's not participating at the level we need to participate to, it is your job to talk to them, no matter who you are, right? It doesn't have to be their supervisor, you peer relationship or whatever. You should question, what they're doing if they're not doing, if they're cutting corners, if they're, and it's not just all the negative stuff, if they're struggling, right? It's like, hey, if somebody's not getting it done, look, it's a tough business, right? It's a very performance oriented industry.
Sure.
It's your job to go check in with them, right? And see
Mhm.
if you can help them. And by the way, you shouldn't ask for anything in return, because that's what humanity is all about, right? Like, that's the carefrontation piece, is like, hey, you should care about those people around you.
Yeah.
And if they're doing things that are incorrect, you should try to do your part to correct them.
Mhm.
And if you see them struggling, you need to intercede to help them, because if you don't, they will leave. So we ended up with this. Now, by the way, a bunch of 20-year-olds don't always do carefrontations correctly. You did end up with some, what I would say modern day HR nightmares. But, but I would tell you 95% of the time it went pretty well. And most of the time when somebody wasn't doing things the way they should be doing, it was they were struggling in disguise. And it helped to have somebody other than their manager walk up to them and say, "Hey, I notice you're coming in every day 30 minutes late. Like, what's going on? You can't do that. It affects everybody here." And they would open up and those types of things. And it actually was pretty refreshing because you didn't feel like you had to hold anything back.
Right.
You could say anything to anybody without feeling like they were going to run and tell their mom, type of thing, or daddy, and get you in trouble. And but it worked very well. And one of the first things that I learned, and I learned this the hard way, by the way, was having a really rough day. We were recruiting really hard. I was working on about 4 or 5 orders, and people may or may not remember this, but one year, I guess it was 95 or 96, I can't remember, a FedEx plane crashed. And unfortunately, the pilots lost their lives and stuff. But, back in those days, it was pre direct deposit. Well, all of our paychecks were on the airplane.
Ooh.
And we were a little thin in the office, and I was slammed. And one of the more senior people to me in the office came up to me and said, "Hey, Macon, I need you to go man the front desk because employees are going to start calling." And I kind of didn't say it this bluntly, but I kind of insinuated it wasn't my job, right? Because I was busy on some other things, you know, and they were very quick to say, "Hey, there's nothing above you here. There's nothing beneath you. And since you
Right.
feel that way, not only are you going to spend the rest of the day at the front desk, you're going to be," and this was a Friday, "you're going to be here all day tomorrow. And you're going to personally answer each call because we deliver paychecks on Friday afternoons most of the time, sometimes on Saturdays. And it's your response. You're a part of the team. It's your responsibility now to communicate to everybody. So it is your job now." And
Wow.
so, little things like that, that was an example of quasi confrontation, right? It's like, "Hey, I'm not going to give you a pass making just because you're busy." There's a lot of people impacted because their paychecks aren't on that or aren't coming. And,
Right.
it's kind of a selfish reaction that you got a lot to do. So we're going to make you do something else. And when you're 21 years old, you need that kind of stuff. Like you need to
Yeah.
understand what reality looks like, you know?
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure you have often thought of that particular
I have.
instance in your career. Yeah, I know. I mean, I think all of us have that time where it's not necessarily that we're feeling lazy, but we are feeling, I don't know, and I don't even know if the word entitled is correct, but we are just kind of stuck in our own bubble. Technology again, I think has enabled us to stay in our own bubbles and culture has encouraged us to stay in our own lane and not rock the boat. They're in large organizations where there's threats of layoffs or things of that nature, people being capriciously put on PIPs or performance improvement plans, they might not want to rock the boat or say something that's unpopular or something of that nature. And so having a culture where that's encouraged, I think in my estimation, and maybe it's because I am sort of in your generation that it actually made sense to us and it was helpful and it gave us pause maybe the next time that we had something like that happen, where we thought better of our attitude and kind of checked ourselves.
Yeah, it's a moment of reflection. Right?
Yeah,
It absolutely and I've carried, those are things there's a lot of things I learned in those, early years working with my friends, and by the way, they're lifelong friends. It's almost college relationship, fraternity relationship type things. The 3 or 4 guys that I started in the office with, we still talk today. I mean, it's we really went through a lot together, learned a lot together, and,
mhm,
the funny thing is I've carried that forward. So when I hire people to work for me today, I caution them, "Hey, I operate a high feedback environment."
right.
And because that's fair, right? Like I'm not if you're not performing well, I'm not going to surprise you. If you're doing a great job, I'm going to recognize it. But I operate a high feedback environment because I always knew where I stood. And fortunately for me, I was a pretty good performer, so I knew I was in good standing, but that doesn't mean I didn't get carefronted every once in a while either, right? Because that was an example where, I was more focused on some things, and I had misjudged the priorities, right? Like, hey, I got to get these things filled, and the paychecks aren't my problem. Oh yeah, they are your problem because there are billable employees, and they're actually more important than somebody we haven't recruited today. And it
Right.
was a great example of a gut check, and I do remember it. And I remember sitting there on Saturday, um, handling all of those people who were calling that didn't get their paychecks dropped off and stuff. And I was like, these people have bills and they've got lives, and this
Sure.
is a super important job. And I was actually in some ways thankful I was doing it, and because they deserve more. And that's another example too, right? If you think about communication, they made sure somebody was there to personally speak to every single person that had and I see things today where companies do a layoff and people get an email in the morning. Like, I can't
Yeah.
imagine, and I don't, and look, I'm not trying to get sideways with some of the largest employers in the US because I might need them as customers one day. But, I can't imagine, coming into work one day and I'm working at Meta and I get a notice after 15 years that I've been laid off on an email. Like, we owe
Yeah.
people more than that, right? Like, they're that's an example where technology is being misused, misappropriated, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. All
Right.
those people have a manager. There's people are people, right? And you owe them a certain level of grace, when you're going to give them the worst news of the year, and maybe the decade or maybe their lives in some cases, like, you owe them more
Sure.
than a text message and an email or a mass conference call where 4,000 people are finding out they're losing their jobs. We owe people more than that. And, and I hate to see it. And, I see it a lot on LinkedIn, and it makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think as we speak today, I was seeing on Blind and Fishbowl, people talking about Amazon layoffs right now. It's like
Yeah.
14,000 people.
Yeah.
And I've worked
Absolutely.
with, yeah, large enterprise high tech companies, and it does happen. It's very, even just as a, somebody who's a vendor to these companies, calling on your clients and people you form relationship with, and to find out they're just unceremoniously gone. You just have no idea, what has happened, and their whole lives have flipped, turned upside down. But yeah, I appreciate the insight on that, and your background. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing in present day, and what your outlook is on the roadmap for 26, 27.
Yeah, so, I accidentally, about 4 years ago, found myself consulting, and, I was working with a company, we went through a transaction, I decided not to continue, I didn't see a clear role for me there, and, it was a lot going on, so I decided to take a package and leave, and, ended up, um I've always kept in touch with so many people, ended up with a lot of consulting opportunities that I thought were gonna be very short term, but they've lasted for years. And, the goal in that are smaller founder-led businesses in most cases, and, some of them are 50 years old, and they're trying to get, um, elevated to the next level. When you're operating a company, like, there's these little resistance levels, just like in a stock, right? You can get up
Sure.
to 10 million, but the behaviors that get you there aren't the ones that are going to get you to 50, and the behaviors at 50 aren't going to get you to 100. You got to learn how to evolve and understand some things, so I've been working heavily with a number of companies for the past 4 years, and I'm a probably a poor consultant because I get really involved, and advisory work I think is supposed to be a little bit more advice. So I'm in there rolling my sleeves up trying to really help, but it aligns well with a lot of what you're talking about. There's so much technology out there, but technology actually is fairly useless and low value if you're not allocating you know it proportionally within your business. And an example of that today is a lot of posting issues that people have. You see it every day. I'm applying to 100 jobs and I'm getting like one standardized email return. Like, there's just so much noise algorithms are broken, and it's affecting companies in our industry too. And trying to get people to come back to that real raw connectivity, which is really what you need. And instead of just using technology to replace your connectivity, it just won't work. Like, you can't hire somebody. I guess you could, because it happens, but it's not a good thing. You're going to miss the best people. You can't hire people with just technology solutions. Maybe you can in certain, very transactional roles and those types of things. But look, but what are you going to get, right? If you're looking to build a company, you want people that understand your story and your value proposition and what you're doing. And so, that's kind of what I'm doing, is helping them understand how to balance their technology portfolio with their business process, and so that they can continue to grow.
Right. And how, in terms of technology,
Oop,
how are
did I lose you,
you,
Kimberly?
what are you, uh-oh, um, can you hear me?
I think I lost you for a second here. Hope I haven't lost you. There you are.
All right. Let's see. I believe we're still recording.
Yeah, it didn't stop.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right. So I'll go ahead and I guess that was the joy of technology, right? When
Yeah,
technology
exactly.
works, it works great, and when it doesn't,
And
it's a well,
exactly.
so what I was going to ask you was, we know definitely, especially in the recruiting staffing business, it's really still very much incumbent on relationships. And so, however, that being said, how are you using, technology and in particular AI to help your clients, or, helping in the business that you are developing?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do, so first of all, I haven't seen any true AI tools yet in our industry. It doesn't mean they don't exist. I just haven't seen them. I've seen a lot of things that have AI attached to them, but they're really algorithmic type tools and automation type things. It's not true. There's not a large language model behind it helping you do the work. And I know that's coming,
Mhm.
but I haven't seen a lot of that. And what I'm trying to do with my clients is getting them to understand that, you know, the technology components of our business isn't necessarily there, shouldn't be there to replace human intervention all the time. It
Right.
should be there to make human intervention more frequent, in some cases, and better. And I think a lot of, especially younger people, right? Because they're coming out of a different type of environment where, they text a lot. They're less, I remember even my kids, my daughter would be on the couch, just mumbling under her breath and banging on that phone with intensity. And I'm like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm fighting with my boyfriend. I'm like, you're not. Like, you can't do that over text. Like, call him up. Let's have the blowout. It's like
Right.
there's you
Oh.
can't replace that human interaction and get your point across, right? But you could, so an example would be, if I was a recruiter, and when I was recruiting, we were making about 125 calls a day,
Mm.
right? With no technology, really. And we had file cabinets full of resumes. That's literally what we were doing. With LinkedIn, that should enable to me to reach out to 250, 300 people a day, because average phone call takes like 30 seconds or something, right? Because you're leaving a lot of messages.
Right.
But what's happened is the actual reverse. A lot of companies, the technology has caused their people to make 20 phone calls a day. And they're replacing phone calls and that personal interaction, with text messages, emails, or actually no action. Like, they're making they're looking at somebody's profile and they're just making a decision like, yeah, I'm not going to call them, and a perfect example would be, somebody applies for a role, the role, they would, a lot of questions on these applications. What's your desired salary? And it says 92,000, and the job pays, even though it's not on the ad, by the way, job pays 85. Well, somebody decides not to call them over $7,000. Well, that's a critical mistake. That would have never happened in our day, right? But today it happens every day. And so you have a really good potential employee and a really good potential client and a really good, career opportunity. And those
Sure.
ships just passed in the night because we've overly depended on a technology solution to, draw all these conclusions. And I do think that the technology tools that I see in our industry are inadvertently replacing connectivity, and in a big way. And it's a shame because it's good for our industry, by the way. We're making more money because of it, because we haven't, our industry specifically, it does actually a little bit better job of it than maybe like internal talent acquisition or something, because that's just who we are.
Right.
But it is a shame, and it's creating a lot of frustration with people out there. I know companies are frustrated. I talk to employers every week who are like, we can't get our roles filled. I don't understand what's going on. And I'm like, yeah, you're getting like 50,000 applicants every week, but nobody's looking at them. Who can look at 50,000 people? Right.
Right.
So we're in this like weird period where technology solutions are coming so fast and they're not actually really working, but everybody's starting to leverage them.
Right.
It's making the problem worse, not better, right? Like, we're in this weird place.
Yeah. That's interesting. So where do you think the gaps are the most? Obviously it's a two-pronged approach with a staffing company itself. There's finding new clients that you're going to service, the companies that you're going to actually find people for, and then the talent that you're trying to find in order to staff those open recs. So where do you
Yeah.
think those gaps are for your clients?
Well, I think there's two things. I think number one, we're overly dependent on the technology. And number two, and this has always been the case, I think that the technology is being misused. And, a lot of these technology solutions have robust parameters that people don't totally understand. And so when they deploy the technology, they're not leveraging the parameters in the right way. So it becomes a big catch-all, and you get too much information, and you can't weed through it, and all of a sudden everything's just broken, right?
Right.
And I think it's always a case where the ability to use the technology is always short,
Sure.
and it because what happens is no matter who you are, if you have some size, it always ends up being the trainer model, right? Somebody decides in the company to buy the technology, procure the technology.
Right.
They decide who gets trained, and then that person turns around, trains some people, and then that person turns around. Well, it's like playing telephone. Next thing you know, by the time the person who's actually deploying the technology is doing something, they're not using it correctly.
Right.
And I think that happens quite a bit. I also think that there's just too much of it. I think companies should spend a little bit more time with fewer tools, so that they can master them, because a lot of them replicate themselves. They all do the same thing, just in different variations.
Mhm.
And we tend to think that casting a bigger net is the right thing to do. That's not always the right thing to do. Um, you know, I've been trying to get my clients to, really narrow down their leveraging their leveraging of technology solutions, because every time a new tool comes out, they want to go buy it. And
Right.
it's like, well, look, your team doesn't know how to use the other 7 tools that you have,
Right.
because we can sit them down in a conference room and I can ask them 10 questions and I'll get answers to 5. Right. So why go spend money on another tool? Wow, this is the latest and greatest. And I'm like, yeah, well, this stuff seems to be pretty good too if we actually knew how to use it, you
Right.
know? And so um, I'm trying to get them to, and because there's a lot of this, like, we have to have it. You hear that about AI every day, right? It's like, look, I got to have it. I got to go invest in it. It's like, well, look, I mean, pace yourself a little bit, because we don't know. Like I said, personally, I haven't not seen a true generative AI hiring solution yet Doesn't
Uh-huh.
mean it doesn't exist. I personally haven't seen one. I've seen a lot of things that are algorithmic based,
Right.
but so are the tools that are 8, 10 years old. It was just Boolean search, algorithms instead of AI algorithms, or, they just, it's the same type of stuff. It's just got relabeled a little bit.
Yeah.
So my advice to companies is master what you have. And by the way, if you don't like what you have, get rid of it and get something else. But
Right.
do the best you can to master what you have. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was an executive at Randstad, I was running one of their companies, and I'll never forget it because we were President's Club, and all the CEOs were down, and we had an emergency meeting. And that weekend, Indeed had sent all of the major staffing companies notice that we were all going to get kicked off their platform,
Oh.
and that they were only going to go direct. And a lot of people don't know this, but Indeed is owned or was owned by a company that owns a lot of staffing companies called Recruit. It's a Japanese firm. And so they were going to allow Recruit to stay on the platform in their companies, but we were all getting kicked out. Right.
Okay. Wow.
And so our answer to that at Ronstadt was, well, look, we need to own a platform. So we ended up acquiring Monster, a year or so later. But
Hmm.
one of the things that happened, and I was a part of a broader team that was analyzing some of this stuff. And we looked at Career Builder, we looked at all the platforms. And in a part of that process, we asked, and they all agreed, can we compare our internal database to your database? Right. And so I remember distinctly that when we synergized our database with Monsters, it was like a 97% match.
Wow.
Right. And then we were able to do another level down that, because after we acquired Monster, because Monster actually isn't the cheapest tool in the world, never was, right? You pay them and then you pay per click and that kind of thing. And then we started realizing that we were paying, X amount of dollars a year to look at the same resume that's been in our database for 10 years. And it's constant. So because people were all there's a certain group of the population that just went to Monster before they went to our internal database. Right. And so it was like, well, if we've got like this 97% overlap of candidates, why do we ever need to go to Monster to begin with? Right. So
Mm.
I actually, in my division, started cutting access. I said, hey, we're going to reduce access to this tool and we need to push people back to our database. That's
Right.
an example where, we weren't using our own tool,
Sure.
that we had invested, which was a Bullhorn database.
Hmm.
We were just going to another one for some odd reason.
Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it made sense probably on its face. You
Yeah.
assume that the most, sort of user facing platform at the time. I mean, Monster was the Indeed of its time for sure. Uh, you would assume that everyone has been on it, and then you're going to get the most updated data on it within database. So that makes perfect sense. But you're right. I mean, if you guys have almost all of the same information, the same candidates, what's the point? Yeah, there seems to be a lot of overlap. I mean, in CRMs, there's agentic AI where they're answering questions and things like that. AI is answering questions for candidates. There's even programs now or agents or whatever platforms where they can do the initial phone screen in with an AI agent initially just to get some, skills assessments. And
Yeah.
so tell me a little bit about that. Have you looked into any of those tools?
I've seen a couple, but they were very basic, right? And I've spent most of my career at the professional level, and so I haven't advised my clients to engage with those firms yet because I worry about reputation damage a little bit on that, right?
Right.
But they're evolving very quickly. Where I have absolutely been a little impatient with my clients and their teams is using readily available AI tools on the sales side.
Right.
Right. I rarely Google anything anymore. Right.
Mhm.
I use Gemini, which is a Google product.
Of
I
course.
use Grok quite a bit. I was using Chat GPT for a while. Then I moved to Perplexity. Now I spend a little bit more time in Grok and Gemini. They seem to be a little bit better for me from a user feel. And I was doing a project with one of my clients for a while. We were sitting at a conference and it was kind of funny. Um, and all these, they have a lot of business in the health insurance space.
Yeah.
And, it was a kind of a strategy meeting, and a couple of guys were chatting, and I'm sitting here, grokking stuff, right? And I'm like, they were like, "Well, there's a software tool called Facets in the health insurance industry," and they're like, "I wonder what companies use Facets." I'm like, "How many Blue Cross Blue Shields use Facets?" And it's like gives me a list. I'm like, "Here you go." Like that would take us a long time before. So that kind of stuff is readily deployable today in sales and business development, and actually executives need to be leaning on that a little bit more
I would agree.
than we probably are. That's a behavioral change. And I intentionally made it. I'm like, hey, I've got to understand AI a little bit better. So I'm not purposely going to Google things anymore. I'm
Uh-huh.
going to use Gemini and I'm going to use Grok. First started out with Chat GPT and Perplexity. I'm just going to stop Googling because that was my behavior. Just instantly go Google and look at all the search returns.
Of course.
And that's a huge productivity gainer to be able to go into Grok or Gemini and start asking questions. I mean, you can ask, I mean, to be honest with you, you can go in there and be like, hey, give me the top operational engineering leadership people, top 5 operational leadership people at AMD, and it'll give you the names, right? And then you can say, do you have contact information for those 5 people? And if it'll go out and get it really quick, and so there are some huge benefits that people are underutilizing today on the business development strategy side.
For sure.
Um,
Yeah, I've actually set up C-level advisory boards, to help with a couple of clients, so that they can ask that advisory board questions. And
yeah,
so, based on whatever it is that their business is, to sort of mimic what other businesses do, creating those C-level advisories has been really helpful as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's so interesting. So sort of look into your crystal ball and tell me what the future looks like for you and your business for the next year or so in terms of, the roadmap itself, sort of the world of work and how technology fits in or how it's still going to have gaps.
Well, I think that and you touched on it a little bit. I think we're quickly approaching, and I don't know the exact timeline, but I promise you it's in the next 48 months, where there is a true, you know, um, AI enabled sourcing screening tool that can really, take a lot of front end work off of the recruiting groups and also be beneficial to the candidates where, I absolutely know this is coming. You apply to a job, the system calls you, or reaches out to you, schedules a call, takes you through some type of basic screen,
Sure.
or even like even more than just a basic screen, and then stack ranking the conversations
Right.
versus stack ranking resumes
Yeah.
and get those in front of people who are making decisions and can actually have a live connect. My hope is that AI will help us connect more than not. Today, it's created lack of connectivity. I'm hoping that it will take we deployed at Ronstadt and my group was one of the first that did it. We deployed robotic process automation in our accounting group and it had the desired outcome. So we automated a lot of things that were very repeatable and repetitive behaviors so
Right.
that our accounts receivables folks could focus on all these invoice issues that required human to human connection. And I remember visiting with the group one day and I was asking them how it was going. And they're like, we're tired. And I'm like, what do you mean you're tired? They're like, we're on the phone all day. And I'm like, and they knew that was a good thing, but it was so different from what they had been doing, right? They were, pulling this and emailing this and all that. But instead, all that repetitive behavior stuff was done now by an RPA program, and they were spending their time outreaching to people where it didn't fit in that box, and they
Right.
were actually solving problems. So they were working harder, but they also felt their job was more rewarding because they were actually doing work that was meaningful and connecting with people. And I'm hoping that's what these AI tools that get deployed, especially on the recruiting side, allow recruiters to do is to actually talk to more people instead of filtering through resumes and having to do these mind numbing sourcing calls, like just checking some boxes. I'm hoping it will create, now it's going to create less jobs as a result of that, but that's okay. The ones that'll be left, there actually might be more meaningful jobs, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's, the point of a lot of these AI tools that I'm seeing are coming across my desk to evaluate for clients or for our business itself, is that it's allowing us to take away some of that, like you said, the repetitive work and become more strategic in the conversations that we're actually having. And that I think also it's because there have been so many layoffs, since there's been, a lot of government layoffs, the whole landscape of work is changing so rapidly. I mean, it's just so fast right now. And job numbers are changing, et cetera. So that's also changing perception of what the landscape looks like. I think that maybe, and people are seeing, like on LinkedIn, I see people or TikTok or Instagram talking about their frustration with applying to 100 jobs a day and getting ghosted and not getting those reactions, et cetera. I think maybe if they're able to then sort of pre-qualify themselves, sort of like in sales, you go through maybe a chat bot and, no, it's not the most ideal customer experience. But if you're able to pre-qualify yourself to where you know that that's just not the job for you, then it enables that person and empowers them to move on to something that's more relevant for their skill set or what they want to do. And it allows that job seeker also to be more strategic in their search. If they know that there's going to be blockers there. If you're just not the candidate, you're going to know right away versus sitting in the black hole or the void, of unknown, like, trough of disillusionment, if you will.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
we want
And
to avoid that as
it's
well.
like every other technology, when it first kind of starts coming out, it doesn't work very well. I go back to cell phones and microwaves and computers. I remember my first computer was like $1,800. I couldn't even do anything with it. I'm like, why did we spend all this money? Have WordPerfect on it. I'm like, I can type something up, and in fact, I'd rather use my word processor. You know what I mean? Because I knew how to use it better. So it's like, and then AOL came out, kind of thing, and all of a sudden everybody could use their computer at home, right? Like,
Right.
the technology never really works when it first comes out, but it catches up pretty quick. And then when it does, it becomes more widely used, more widely understood, more widely adaptable, and it becomes, just way more effective. And cell phones and stuff are the right example, right? We went from flip phones to Blackberries really fast,
Yes.
and from Blackberries to what now is the touchscreen, stuff really quickly. And the first ones weren't that great, but they improved very rapidly and became very user friendly and very effective very quickly. And I think these tools are going to do the same thing. So I think in the next 48 months, it's going to be tremendously different. I think that the system will be much more efficient. We're just in that broken inefficiency testing phase right now, where
Yeah.
everybody's trying to be first, and so they're throwing stuff out there, and we're using stuff that isn't quite baked.
Right.
Um, and it's creating a little more. Look, I was one of the first guys with a cell phone because of the industry, right?
Yep.
But there was no cell tower, so it never worked. Like it didn't matter. I still had to pull off and put a quarter in a payphone to call the office because the cell phone never worked. And I was like, why the hell did I get this thing?
And it was
Um,
also huge. Remember, did you have the
yeah, it
brick?
was a big bag phone,
Yeah.
right? Like it literally was a bag phone. I plugged it into my car lighter.
Yes, yes.
And
Oh, yeah. That's true. I didn't have the
yep,
the bag phone. I had my friend had the bag. I had the brick.
yeah, yeah, yep,
Yeah, I definitely understand that. Well, listen, I know we're at time, and I really appreciate all the insight today. Talking to you about the world of work, your experience is vast and varied, and I really appreciate it. I hope we can talk again soon. Um,
absolutely, my pleasure.
so that being said, that's it for today's episode of Exec Edge by Uniqua AI. Really thank you for joining us. And for you, the audience, if you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating. And for more AI insights, visit uniquaai.com and join our newsletter so you don't get left behind. Now let's go put those insights into action, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.